No ship appeared on the augur arrays, no warp signature registered, no shimmering curtain of the Imperium parted to vomit a vessel into the cold vacuum of real space. Yet something fell from the black sky of Kaltos, leaving only questions and the acrid, metallic stench of damnation in its wake. In the 41st millennium, the laws of physics are merely suggestions, and faith reshapes reality itself. But what happens when something from beyond the veil of stars arrives with its own immutable laws? The Imperium had conquered 1,000,000 worlds and faced horrors that would shatter a mortal's mind, but they were devastatingly wrong to assume they had seen the pinnacle of martial violence. On the world of Kaltos, amidst the screams of a dying population and the roar of Khornati berserkers, the definition of toughness was about to be rewritten in blood and green-tinted ceramite. If you're hungry for tales of what-if scenarios that shake the foundations of the 41st millennium, hit subscribe and join the crusade for more content. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the Dark Millennium. The world of Kaltos was a secondary industrial hub in the Agrippina sector, a cog in the machine of the Imperium now caught in the teeth of the Great Rift. The cicatrix maledictum bled across the firmament, a jagged wound of purple and bruised gold that turned the night into a fever dream. Below, the red tide of Khorne had risen. The World Eaters had come, their chain axes singing a dirge of slaughter through the hab blocks and manufacturums. The local Astra Militarum regiments had been pulverized within hours. Even the arrival of a strike force from the Iron Hands chapter, transhuman warriors of cold logic and cybernetic strength, had only slowed the inevitable. The Space Marines were tough, their bones reinforced with ceramic, their hearts doubled, their wills forged in the fires of 1,000 wars. But they were dying. In the center of the capital city's burning plaza, Brother Sergeant Arkan of the Iron Hands swung his power fist, crushing the skull of a bloodletter even as a second demon's hell blade sheared through his shoulder guard. The pain was a distant data point, suppressed by combat stims and mental conditioning. He looked up, his bionic eye flickering as it tracked a falling object. It wasn't a drop pod. It wasn't a piece of orbital debris. It was a streak of emerald fire cutting through the crimson haze of the sky. The impact didn't just shake the ground. It shattered the local tectonic plate. A shock wave of pure kinetic force flattened the surrounding ruins, snuffing out the fires and throwing both demons and humans aside like chaff. From the center of the smoldering crater, a silhouette emerged. He was a giant, though shorter than a Primaris Marine. His armor was a deep, weathered green, missing the ornate scrolls and religious iconography of the Imperium. It was functional, brutal, and pulsed with a low, thrumming heat that made the very air around him vibrate. This was the Doomslayer, the Unchained Predator, a being who had spent aeons in the pits of a different hell. As he stepped out of the crater, his visor, a dark, impenetrable slate, scanned the battlefield. He didn't see a holy war. He didn't see the glory of the Emperor or the majesty of chaos. He saw what he always saw: targets. The World Eaters, sensing a new prey, turned from the butchered remains of the PDF. With a collective, guttural roar of blood for the blood god, a dozen berserkers charged. These were the elite of the Long War, veterans of 10,000 years of genocide. They moved with a speed that defied their bulk, their chain axes revving to a high-pitched scream. The Slayer didn't flinch. He didn't take a defensive stance. He moved. The speed was wrong. To Brother Arkan, watching through the haze of blood and oil, the stranger's movement looked like a glitch in reality. The Slayer wasn't just fast, he was instantaneous. He met the first World Eater mid-charge. Instead of a clash of blades, there was a wet, sickening thud. The Slayer's fist, unaugmented by a power field but driven by the weight of a primeval soul, drove straight through the Mark IV power armor, punching a hole through the Marine's chest and out the back. Before the first corpse could hit the ground, the Slayer had gripped the second Marine's chain-axe arm. With a casual, terrifying twist, he snapped the ceramite and bone like dry kindling. He ripped the weapon from the dying traitor's hand and buried it in the skull of a third, the teeth of the axe chewing through a reinforced helmet in a spray of gray matter and sparks. Then came the Null-Effect. As the Slayer operated at full capacity, his internal resonance, the divinity machine's gift, began to interact with the local atmosphere of Kaltos. The warp, which usually pressed heavily on this world, began to recoil. The purple light of the great rift seemed to dim in a localized sphere around him. To the demons of Khorne, the Slayer wasn't just a physical threat. He was a void. He was a hole in the universe where the warp could not go. The blood letters hissed, their forms flickering as the psychic static emanating from the Slayer disrupted their tether to real space. The Slayer reached behind his back and drew a double-barreled shotgun. It looked primitive compared to a bolter, yet when he pulled the trigger, the boom was the sound of a closing tomb. The lead didn't just penetrate, it was infused with a trace of argent energy that reacted violently with the chaotic essence of the blood letters. They didn't just die, they evaporated into red mist. Brother Arkan watched as the stranger performed a glory kill on a World-Eater champion. The Slayer kicked the giant's knee out, forced him to the ground, and with a single, fluid motion, wrenched the champion's own head from his shoulders, spine trailing behind like a macabre tail. It was a level of violence that made even the iron hands feel a flicker of something long forgotten. Awe. But the Slayer was not alone in his arrival. High above the planet, aboard the Vigil of Gold, a golden-hulled strike cruiser of the Adeptus Custodes, sensors had flared with an impossibility. Shield Captain Tyvar of the Aquilan Shield stood at the bridge, his golden armor reflecting the flickering lights of the auger screens. "My lord," a tech priest stammered, his mechadendrites twitching in agitation. "The anomaly on the surface. It is not a warp entity, but the warp is dying in its presence. The localized reality is stabilizing, the prophecy of the green flame mentioned in the scrolls of the Ordo Draxis. It is occurring." Tyvar gripped the pommel of his guardian spear. The Custodes were the Emperor's own guards, the pinnacle of human evolution. Each was a work of art, a warrior philosopher who surpassed space marines in every conceivable metric. They were the 10,000, and they did not leave the Sol system for trivialities, but a being that could stabilize reality simply by existing. That was a threat to the Golden Throne's monopoly on divine order, or a potential tool of it. "Prepare the teleportarium," Tyvar commanded, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. "We will secure this anomaly. If it resists, we shall remind Kaltos why we are the masters of the long vigil. Space Marines are the blunt instrument of the Imperium. We are the Emperor's sharpest blade. Let us see if this stranger can withstand the gold." On the surface, the Slayer finished his immediate work. 100 traitors and demons lay in pieces. He stood amidst the carnage, the wind whipping his brown hair as he reloaded his weapon. He looked up. A flash of blinding gold light erupted 100 yards away. As the light faded, 5 giants stood there. They were taller than the Slayer, clad in auramite that shone with the radiance of a captive sun. Their guardian spears were leveled with practiced, lethal precision. They didn't roar like the World-Eaters. They didn't calculate like the Iron Hands. They moved with the grace of dancers and the lethality of gods. The Slayer's visor fixed on the central figure, Tyvar. He saw the power radiating from them, saw the gold, and he saw the way the survivors of the PDF fell to their knees in worship. The Slayer didn't kneel. He didn't speak. He simply chambered a fresh shell. The air grew cold. The psychic static intensified, making the Custodes' own enhanced senses ring with a high-pitched whine. The first contact between the ultimate defenders of the throne and the ultimate destroyer of hell was not a parley. It was a silent challenge. Tyvar took a step forward, his voice amplified by his Vox grill. "Halt, stranger. You stand in the presence of the Adeptus Custodes. Drop your weapons and submit to the Emperor's justice, or be unmade." The Slayer's response was simple. He ignited the Doom Blade on his left gauntlet. The serrated steel hissed as it extended. The Custodes were tough. They were the best the 41st millennium had to offer. But as the Slayer's boots crunched on the bloody soil, he prepared to show them that tough was a relative term. The silence that followed Tyvar's command was heavier than the smog-choked air of Kaltos. For the survivors of the Iron Hands and the cowering PDF, the scene was a tableau of impossible divinity. On one side stood the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the Emperor's own companions, warriors who viewed the legendary Space Marines as clumsy children. On the other stood a lone figure in battered green, a silent sentinel who had just dismantled a World Eater's warband with the clinical detachment of a butcher. Shield Captain Tyvar did not move, but his mind was racing at speeds a mortal could not comprehend. His enhanced physiology processed the visual data. The stranger's stance was perfect, his weight distributed for a leap in any direction. There was no fear in the man, only a cold, radiating intent that Tyvar had only ever seen in the eyes of the most ancient dreadnoughts. "I will not repeat myself," Tyvar said, his guardian spear, the gilded talon, humming as its power field stabilized. "By the authority of the Golden Throne, disarm." The Slayer's only answer was a subtle shift in his footing. The psychic static, the Null-Effect caused by his alien resonance, began to grate against the Custodes' senses. While custodians were famously resistant to the warp, they were not blanks. They possessed souls forged in the Emperor's image. To them, the Slayer felt like a tear in the tapestry of reality, a freezing wind blowing from a universe that shouldn't exist. "He is a void, Shield Captain," whispered Voltar, the custodian to Tyvar's left, his bolter-cased spear locked onto the Slayer's chest. "My helm's sensors are cycling. He has no warp signature, yet his kinetic output is impossible." The Slayer didn't wait for them to finish their analysis. He knew when a parley was merely a prelude to a cage. With a burst of speed that bypassed the acceleration phase entirely, the Slayer moved. He didn't run. He vanished and reappeared. To the Iron Hand sergeant watching from the ruins, it looked like a frame of film had been cut. One moment the Slayer was 10 yards away. The next, he was in the face of the nearest custodian. The Custodes reacted with the preternatural grace that defined their order. Voltar swung the butt of his spear in a sweeping arc intended to shatter the stranger's ribs. The Slayer didn't duck. He caught the shaft of the weapon. The sound of palm meeting auramite echoed like a thunderclap. The custodian's eyes widened behind his plasteel visor. No one, not even an Ogren in power armor, should have the raw strength to halt a custodian's strike with one hand. The Slayer's other hand, holding the double-barreled super shotgun, came up. Tyvar moved faster. The Shield Captain's guardian spear flashed in a blur of gold, the blade catching the barrel of the shotgun just as the Slayer pulled the trigger. The blast was redirected upward, the twin slugs screaming into the sky and vaporizing a passing gargoyle demon. The recoil alone would have broken a human shoulder. The Slayer didn't even waver. He dropped the shotgun, letting it hang by its magnetic tether, and launched a knee into Voltar's midsection. The blow sent the 500-pound golden giant skidding back 20 feet, his auramite boots carving deep trenches into the ferrocrete. "Sedition!" Voltar growled, recovering instantly, his spear coming up to fire. "Wait!" Tyvar commanded, his voice a clarion call that halted his brother's triggers. He stood between the Slayer and his men, his spear held in a neutral position. He had felt the strength of that shotgun blast's redirection. It wasn't just gunpowder, it was a focused kinetic event. He did not aim for the head. He aimed to displace. He is testing us. The Slayer stood his ground, his doom blade still hissing, his dark visor fixed on Tyvar. He seemed to recognize the shield captain as the leader, the Alpha. In his own world, the Slayer had led the Night Sentinels. He knew the weight of command. He also knew that these golden warriors were fundamentally different from the great angels he had heard the mortals whisper about. They were faster, more precise, and their gear was of a quality that rivaled Sentinel craftsmanship. The tension was broken not by words, but by the ground itself. A roar, louder and more primal than any world eater, erupted from the massive cathedral manufacturum at the plaza's edge. The stained glass windows, depicting the Emperor's rise, shattered outward as a monstrosity of brass and blood-slicked muscle tore its way into the light. It was a bloodthirster of the unfettered fury, a greater demon of Khorne. It stood 30 feet tall, its wings spanning the width of the street, a whip of fire in one hand, and an axe the size of a rhino transport in the other. Behind it, a fresh wave of bloodletters and flesh hounds poured out like a ruptured cyst of the warp. The demon's presence was a physical weight, a psychic pressure that made the iron hands collapse and the PDF soldiers claw at their own eyes. But to the Slayer, it was a familiar stench. To the Custodes, it was the ultimate blasphemy. The bloodthirster's eyes, glowing like dying stars, fixed on the group in the plaza. It ignored the humans, it ignored the space marines. It saw the gold, and it saw the green. "Skulls for the skull throne," the demon bellowed, the sound waves cracking the surrounding stone. "The Emperor's puppets, and the interloper, you shall both bleed." Tyvar looked at the Slayer. The green-armored giant was already moving. He wasn't retreating, he was reloading. The Slayer slid 2 fresh shells into the super shotgun with a mechanical clack that sounded remarkably like a death knell. "Shield Captain?" Voltar asked, his spear's bolter unit chattering as he began picking off the charging flesh hounds. Tyvar watched the Slayer. The stranger didn't look at the Custodes again. He simply began a slow, predatory walk toward the greater demon. Every step he took, the Null-Effect expanded. The ground beneath his feet stopped bleeding. The screaming voices of the warp that usually accompanied a bloodthirster's presence were silenced, replaced by a low-frequency hum of pure, unadulterated aggression. "The prophecy did not say the green flame would be our servant," Tyvar muttered, his mind making a tactical decision in a fraction of a second. "It said it would be a scourge. For now, the scourge's aim is true." Tyvar leveled his spear at the bloodthirster. "Custodes, for the Emperor, support the anomaly. Let nothing stand between him and the beast." The battle that followed was a symphony of destruction. The Custodes moved like a golden tide, their spears weaving a web of bolter fire and power blade strikes that decapitated bloodletters by the dozen. They were the pinnacle of Imperial martial art, controlled, elegant, and perfect. The Slayer was the antithesis. He was a hurricane of toughness and violence. He used the meat hook on his shotgun to launch himself into the air, the chain latching onto the bloodthirster's brass collar. He swung around the demon's massive neck, his doom blade carving a deep furrow through the warp-touched metal and into the flesh beneath. The bloodthirster roared in agony, its fire whip lashing out to incinerate the Slayer. The Slayer dropped, landed in a roll, and came up firing the plasma rifle. The blue bolts didn't just burn, they overloaded the demon's localized reality anchor. Tyvar watched, stunned, as the Slayer moved through the horde. Where a space marine would take cover, the Slayer dashed. Where a custodian would parry, the Slayer simply stepped into the blow, using his shoulder to redirect the force and countering with a point-blank blast that turned a flesh hound into a red smear. It was a level of combat efficiency that bordered on the divine. The Slayer wasn't fighting the demons, he was harvesting them. "He is not using the warp," Voltar shouted over the vox, his spear impaling 3 blood letters at once. "But he is breaking it. Look at the demon's form." The bloodthirster was losing its cohesion. The Slayer's presence was acting as a stabilizing anchor for real space, making it harder for the demon to maintain its physical shape. Every time the Slayer struck, he seemed to draw something from the air, flecks of orange essence that flew into his armor, sealing the minor chinks the demon's whip had managed to find. The Slayer was a self-sustaining engine of war. Tyvar realized then that the title Space Marine was an insult to what he was witnessing. Even a custodian fought with the knowledge that he was protecting something, a throne, an ideal, a world. This stranger fought as if his only purpose in the universe was the total eradication of the foe. The bloodthirster swung its massive axe in a desperate, horizontal cleave. Tyvar leaped over it, his spear carving a line across the demon's chest. But the Slayer didn't leap. He dashed under the swing, pulled out a massive, humming hammer, the Sentinel Hammer, and brought it down on the demon's foot. The impact didn't just break the demon's stance. It sent a shockwave of golden-green energy through the ground, stunning every Khorniter entity within 50 yards. "Now!" Tyvar yelled. The shield captain and the Slayer reached the demon's head at the same time. Tyvar's spear went through the throat. The Slayer's hand gripped the demon's lower jaw. With a roar that rivaled the demon's own, the Slayer didn't just kill the bloodthirster. He began to pull. The sound of the bloodthirster's end was not a scream, but a wet, structural failure of reality itself. As the Slayer's fingers, clad in the cold, unyielding alloy of the Praetor suit, dug into the demon's brass-clad jaw, the air around them ignited. Tyvar's guardian spear remained buried in the beast's throat, the power field flickering as it struggled against the sheer density of the demon's departing essence. But the Slayer did not rely on power fields. He relied on the absolute, primordial strength of a being who had outlasted empires and outfought gods. With a heave that caused the ferrocrete beneath his boots to pulverize into dust, the Slayer wrenched backward. The bloodthirster's jaw gave way with the sound of a snapping ship's mast. The Slayer didn't stop. He planted a boot on the demon's chest and pulled again, his muscles tightening with a force that would have shattered the chassis of a dreadnought. The demon's head was torn clean from its shoulders, spine trailing in a shower of dissolving ichor and discordant warp fire. The Slayer stood over the evaporating corpse, the severed head still gripped in one hand. He looked at it for a silent second, then crushed the skull into a pulp of bone and shadow before tossing it aside. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining blood letters, their anchor to the world severed by the death of their master and the overwhelming Null-Effect of the Slayer, flickered like dying candles before vanishing back into the Imperium. Tyvar withdrew his spear, his movements slow and deliberate. He signaled his men to hold their positions. The Custodes stood in a semicircle, and their weapons lowered, but not stowed. They were witnessing something that defied the imperial truth and the Lex Imperialis alike. A lone, unaugmented-looking human, or something that wore the shape of one, had just performed a feat of strength that would have tested a Primarch. "Your combat efficiency is noted," Tyvar said, his voice echoing in the hollowed-out plaza. "But you are an unknown quantity in a sector where ignorance is a death sentence. By the Emperor's will, I must demand you surrender your weapons for study. You are a danger to the stability of this world." The Slayer turned. He didn't look tired. He didn't look wounded. The orange essence he had absorbed from the fallen demons had already knitted the few tears in his suit. He looked at Tyvar, then at the other 4 custodians. He saw their aura might, their height, and their perfection. He also saw the Iron Hand Sergeant, Arkan, crawling toward them, his bionic limbs sparking. The Slayer reached for the hilt of the crucible attached to his back. "Stand down!" Tyvar barked, his spear snapping up. "We are the 10,000! We are the shield of the throne!" The Slayer moved. It wasn't a charge. It was a blur. He didn't aim to kill, but he refused to be detained. He closed the distance to Voltar, the custodian on the left, before the giant could even depress his thumb trigger. The Slayer's shoulder hit Voltar's chest like a kinetic strike from orbit. The 500-pound custodian was vaulted backward, his armor clashing against a ruined pillar. Tyvar lunged, the gilded talon whistling through the air in a strike meant to pin the Slayer's arm to the ground. So the Slayer transitioned his weight with a grace that made the Custodes' own movements look sluggish. He caught the shaft of the spear just below the power blade, his palm smoking as the power field bit into his glove. With a sharp lateral jerk, he pulled Tyvar off balance and delivered a palm strike to the shield captain's faceplate. The sound was like a hammer hitting an anvil. Tyvar's head snapped back, his vision flickering red as the internal dampeners of his helm struggled to compensate for the shock. For 3 seconds, it was a dance of titans. The Custodes moved with the synchronized perfection of a machine, their spears weaving a cage of steel and fire. The Slayer moved like a ghost, dashing through gaps that shouldn't exist, using his sheer toughness to ignore the glancing blows of bolter rounds that would have turned a space marine into red paste. The duel ended as abruptly as it began. The Slayer jumped backward, landing on the hood of a burnt-out Chimera transport. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood there, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pace. "Enough!" Tyvar shouted, raising a hand to his brothers. He tasted blood in his mouth. An impossibility. His jaw was bruised, a custodian, bruised by a single blow. He is not an enemy of the throne, he is an enemy of everything else. "Shield Captain," Voltar voxed, his voice tight with suppressed anger as he rejoined the line. He struck a custodian. The law is clear. Death is the only penance for such a trespass. "The law was written for men, Voltar," Tyvar replied, and his eyes never leaving the Slayer's visor. "Look at the sky, look at the warp." They looked. The great rift, which had been a screaming maw of purple madness since they arrived on Kaltos, was changing. The area directly above the plaza was clearing. The stars, the real, cold stars, were visible for the first time in months. The Slayer wasn't just a warrior. He was a psychic sync. His presence was drawing the warp into himself, neutralizing it and venting it as harmless kinetic energy and heat. But this warp siphon effect had a terrifying byproduct. From the vox casters of the Iron Hands and the nearby command centers, a new sound emerged. Screaming, not the screams of the dying, but the psychic agony of the world's psychers. "The astropaths," Sergeant Archon croaked, his voice filtered through a cracked vox grill. They're burning out. The librarians on the merciless logic. They report a black hole, a void that eats the soul. The Slayer's presence was so tough, so immutable, that it was creating a localized shadow in the warp, similar to a Tyrannid hive fleet, but far more concentrated. To a psyker, the Slayer wasn't just a man. He was an erasure. He was the end of the song. The Slayer seemed to realize the effect he was having. He looked at the trembling humans in the ruins. For the first time, a flicker of something, perhaps regret or a weary understanding, passed through his posture. He reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small metallic sphere, a Vega backup drive. He held it out toward Tyvar. "What is this?" Tyvar asked, stepping forward cautiously. The Slayer didn't answer. He threw the sphere. Tyvar caught it in a massive, at the golden hand. "It is technology," the shield captain muttered, his helm's sensors scanning the device. "Silicon-based, but with a logic architecture that is ancient. Pre-Dark Age of technology? No, something else." Suddenly, the air grew cold again. The Null-Effect spiked. The Slayer turned his head toward the north, toward the hive city of Bastion Primus. His visor hummed as he zoomed in on the distant spires. He didn't need a map. He didn't need a briefing. He could smell it, the scent of a different kind of rot. Not the frenzied bloodlust of Khorne, but the stagnant, decaying ambition of the Black Legion. They were coming, led by a sorcerer lord who had sensed the void and sought to claim it or destroy it. The Slayer looked back at the Custodes. He pointed toward the city, then slammed a fist against his own chest. It was a gesture of intent. He was going to the source. He was going to kill whatever was causing the rot. "You think to walk into a hive city held by the traitor legions alone?" Voltaire asked, his skepticism clear. "There are tens of thousands of heretic Astartes there. Millions of cultists, engines of war that can level mountains." The Slayer didn't respond. He simply turned and began to run. He didn't run like a human. He was a green streak, his boots cracking the pavement with every stride, moving at speeds that rivaled a land speeder. Tyvar watched him go, then looked at the sphere in his hand. He looked at the Iron Hand sergeant, then at his brothers. "He is the ultimate weapon," Tyvar said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And he is uncontrolled. If we do not follow him, the Black Legion will either die or find a way to turn that void against the segmentum. Either way, the Emperor's work on this world is not done." "We follow the anomaly?" Voltaire asked. "No," Tyvar said, his guardian spear sparking as he turned toward the hive. "We follow the Slayer. If he is the flame, we shall be the wind that fans it." As the golden giants ignited their jump packs and leapt into the air to follow the green blur, the people of Kaltos watched in silence. They had seen space marines fight. They had seen Custodes arrive, but for the first time in their lives, they felt something they hadn't felt since the Great Rift opened. They felt hope, and it was a hope that smelled of gunpowder and scorched hellfire. The approach to Bastion Primus was a descent into a mechanical purgatory. The hive city was a mountain of iron and sorrow, its base sprawling for hundreds of miles in a tangled web of refineries, hab slums, and defensive bastions. Normally, the air around such a concentrated center of human suffering would be thick with the psychic miasma of the warp, a feast for the predatory entities of the Imperium. But as the Doomslayer sprinted across the ash wastes, he carried a bubble of absolute, terrifying silence with him. It was a psychic siphon that didn't just repel the warp, it inhaled it. Behind him, the Adeptus Custodes struggled to keep pace. Even with their jump packs flaring in controlled bursts, the Slayer's cross-country speed was anomalous. He moved with a relentless, rhythmic thud, his boots hitting the ground with enough force to crack the permafrost, never slowing for obstacles, leaping over derelict tanks and shattered bulkheads with a single kinetic surge. "Brother Captain, the Null-Effect is intensifying," Voltaire voxed, his voice straining against the psychic pressure. The vox channels are dead air. The sensors are ghosting. It's as if the world is being erased behind him. Tyvar felt it too. To a custodian whose mind was a fortress of crystalline logic and indoctrinated faith, the sensation was like a persistent, high-frequency hum in the marrow of his bones. But for the psychers of Kaltos, it was an apocalypse. As the Slayer neared the hive's outer perimeter, the screaming in the Vox network reached a crescendo and then abruptly stopped. On the Vigil of Gold in high orbit, the ship's navigators had been forced into medically induced comas to prevent their brains from liquefying. The Slayer was a biological pariah nexus, a moving dead zone that was stabilizing the physical world while lobotomizing the spiritual one. In the command spire of Bastion Primus, the Black Legion sorcerer lord, Zorphus, felt the change with agonizing clarity. To a master of the arcane, the warp was a sea of infinite possibility. The Slayer was a sudden, localized freezing of that sea. "Something is coming," Zorphus hissed, his voice a rasp of dry parchment. He clutched his force staff, the eye at its tip blinking in terror. A void, a silence that hungers. It is not the Emperor's light. It is not the shadow in the warp. It is an ending. Zorphus turned to his lieutenants. Chosen of the Black Legion, to warriors who had stood on the walls of Terra 10 millennia ago. Deploy the decimators. Unleash the hellbrutes. Whatever this void is, it must be filled with blood before it reaches the gate. The Slayer didn't wait for the gates to open. As he reached the shadow of the hive's primary curtain wall, a 500-foot precipice of reinforced plasteel, he didn't look for a breach. He drew the ballista. The weapon hummed with a concentrated blue light, a signature of energy that made the Custodes' eyes flare. With a sound like a thunderclap, the Slayer fired. The bolt of pure energy didn't just explode, it bored a hole through the 10-meter-thick plating as if it were parchment. The Slayer leapt through the molten gap, disappearing into the dark industrial bowels of the outer hive. Tyvar and his squad landed moments later at the edge of the breach. The metal was still white-hot, dripping like wax. Valtar reached out to touch the edge, his gauntlet's sensors screaming warnings. This is not melter-fire. This is concentrated kinetic plasma. I've seen nothing like this in the Imperial armory. Focus, Tyvar commanded, stepping into the dark. The Black Legion is reacting. They will try to bottle him in the lower manufacturums. We provide the flank. The interior of the outer hive was a labyrinth of macro pipes and conveyor belts, now repurposed by the Black Legion into a factory of desecration. Bodies were hung from hooks, their blood channeled into cooling vats for demon engines. But the usual chanting of the cultists was gone. They were lying on the floor, clutching their heads, and their minds shattered by the Null-Effect the Slayer radiated. The Slayer moved through the facility like a scythe. He didn't use the ballista anymore. He used his hands and the super shotgun. A squad of traitor guard attempted to barricade a narrow corridor with a heavy bolter. The Slayer dashed through the fire, the explosive rounds detonating against his praetor suit in harmless sprays of sparks. He reached the barricade and simply walked through it, the sheer mass of his movement crushing the sandbags and the men behind them. Then the floor shook. From the shadows of the massive smelting vats, a decimator siege engine lumbered forward. It was a twisted fusion of machine and demon, its twin soul burner cannons glowing with baleful warp fire. It let out a metallic roar that should have shattered the Slayer's resolve. Instead, as the Slayer switched to the rocket launcher, he didn't fire from cover. He stood in the center of the walkway and unleashed a volley of lock-on bursts. The rockets didn't just hit the decimator. They targeted its weak points, the fleshy joins between the armor plates. The explosions tore the demon engine's limbs from its torso. As the machine collapsed, the Slayer was already on top of it. He plunged his doom blade into the glowing eye of the engine, twisting the serrated steel until the demon within screamed its last and dissolved into a puddle of foul-smelling oil. The Custodes arrived just in time to see the Slayer ripping the decimator's primary cannon from its housing to use as a club against a second engine. He is efficient, Valtar remarked, his guardian spear clearing a path through a group of dazed cultists. Oh, he is more than efficient, Tyvar said, parrying a strike from a Black Legionary who had managed to resist the psychic static. He is an ecological disaster for the warp. Look at the shadows, Valtar. They aren't moving. The warp taint in this room is being digested. It was true. The Slayer's presence was acting as a localized warp siphon, drawing the lingering chaotic energy out of the machinery and the very walls. The gore-slicked icons of the Black Legion were losing their glow. The demons bound to the engines were being forcibly evicted from real space, not by banishment, but by the fact that the environment was becoming too real for them to inhabit. But this stabilization came at a horrific cost. A group of Imperial citizens, kept as slaves in the manufacturum, were screaming in unison. To them, the Slayer's presence felt like their souls were being pulled through a needle's eye. The toughness of the Slayer's reality was so absolute that it brooked no competitors, not even the fragile psychic spark of a human soul. The Slayer stopped. He looked at the slaves. For a moment, the relentless killing machine hesitated. He looked at his hands, then at the suffering humans. He seemed to understand that his very existence in this universe was a poison to those he might wish to protect. "He knows," Tyvar whispered, his golden helm tilting. "He knows he is a curse as much as a cure." The moment was shattered by a psychic scream that bypassed the Null-Effect. Lord Zorphus had arrived, flanked by a coven of sorcerers. They weren't using the warp. They couldn't. Instead, they were using forbidden, to ancient tech, hexagrammic wands and void grenades. "Abomination!" Zorphus shrieked, his voice echoing through the vox. "You are the void that kills the dream. You are the silence of the grave. If the warp cannot claim you, the cold dark shall." Zorphus raised a hand, and a containment field, a shimmering cage of blue geometry, erupted around the Slayer. It was an Inquisitorial-grade stasis trap, designed to hold even a greater demon. The Slayer hit the walls of the cage, his fists sparking against the energy. For the first time, he was contained. Tyvar leveled his spear. "Custodes, engage! If the Black Legion captures that entity, they will find a way to weaponize the void." But as the Custodes charged, the Slayer did something they didn't expect. He didn't try to break the cage with strength. He reached for the crucible hilt on his back, and the red blade ignited. And the Null-Effect didn't just spike, it exploded. The energy of the crucible wasn't of the warp, and it wasn't of the physical world. It was something else entirely. The stasis cage didn't just break, it shattered into 1,000 shards of light. The backlash sent Zorphus and his sorcerers flying across the room. The Slayer stepped out of the ruins of the trap, the crucible blade glowing like a dying star in his hand. He looked at the Custodes, then at the Black Legion. The Toughness of the 41st millennium had just met a weapon that didn't care about its laws, and the Slayer was no longer just a visitor. He was the judge. The ignition of the crucible blade changed the color of the air. It wasn't the sickly, flickering purple of the warp, nor the harsh artificial white of Imperial glow globes. It was a dense, arterial red, a color of absolute finality. As the Slayer stepped through the crystalline wreckage of the stasis trap, the Null-Effect reached a terrifying equilibrium. The psychic screaming of the nearby slaves stopped, replaced by a heavy, pressurized silence that made the ears of the custodians pop. For Tyvar, looking at the blade was like staring into the heart of a sun that refused to give heat. "That weapon," Voltar hissed, his guardian spear trembling in a way a custodian's hands never should. "It feels like a denial. It is not of the warp, but it is not of the Imperium. Shield Captain, the purity of that energy is disturbing." "It is a tool of the end," Tyvar replied, his voice a low growl. He didn't lower his spear, but he didn't point it at the Slayer. "Observe the Black Legion. They fear it more than they fear us." Lord Zorphus had scrambled backward, his ceramite boots clattering against the blood-stained floor. The Sorcerer Lord was a veteran of the Long War, a being who had looked upon the face of Primarchs and demons alike, but the sight of the Crucible seemed to strip away his 10,000 years of arrogance. To a creature of the warp, the Slayer's blade was a literal eraser, a thing that didn't just kill, but unmade the very concept of the soul. "Burn them!" Zorphus shrieked, pointing a shaking finger. "Unleash the Hollowed. If the Void wants to eat, let it choke on the dead." From the darkened ventilation shafts and the massive to rusted cooling vats, the Hollowed emerged. These were the Black Legion's most horrific insurance policy. Shells of former Imperial citizens and failed Astartes candidates, their minds erased and their bodies stuffed with volatile warp chemicals and mechanical failsafes. Because they had no souls to be suppressed, the Slayer's Null-Effect didn't lobotomize them. It merely turned them into mindless kinetic puppets. Hundreds of them poured into the manufacturum, a tide of grey flesh and clicking augmetics. The Slayer didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a tactical plan. He swung the crucible in a horizontal arc. The blade didn't just cut, it vaporized everything in its path. A dozen Hollowed were bisected, their pressurized chemical tanks detonating in a chain reaction of green fire. The Slayer moved through the explosions, and his Praetor suit absorbing the heat as he transitioned from the Crucible to the Sentinel Hammer, with a speed that defied the laws of inertia. "Custodes, into the breach," Tyvar commanded. "We do not let the anomaly fall. We are the anvil to his hammer." The 5 golden giants charged. This was the moment where the comparison became undeniable. A space marine of the Iron Hands would have formed a firing line using cold logic and systematic bolter fire to thin the herd. They would have been tough, reliable, and eventually overwhelmed. The Custodes were different. They were a whirlwind of aura might, their spears spinning in complex, lethal geometries that turned the Hollowed into a fine mist of meat and scrap metal. Each strike was perfect, each movement a masterpiece of martial philosophy. But the Slayer was a force of nature. From he was Toughness evolved into an offensive weapon. He didn't parry. He moved through the attacks. When a Hollowed suicide bomber lunged at him, the Slayer caught the creature by the head, used its momentum to swing it into a second attacker, and then stomped the first one into the floor with such force that the Ferrocrete buckled for 10 yards. He was using the Sentinel Hammer now, and every impact sent a shockwave of energy through the room that stunned the Hollowed and disrupted the Sorcerer's remaining charms. The atmosphere of the manufacturum was a sensory nightmare. The smell of ozone from the Custodes' power blades mingled with the acrid stench of the Slayer's gunpowder, and the sweet, cloying rot of the Hollowed's chemical vats. The sound was a deafening cacophony. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the Slayer's boots, of the high-pitched crack of bolter fire, and the low-frequency hum of the Null-Effect vibrating in everyone's teeth. "Shield Captain, look at the Slayer's pace," Voltar shouted over the Vox, decapitating a Hollowed with a backhand swing of his spear. "He is accelerating. He isn't just fighting, he's hunting." Tyvar saw it. The Slayer was ignoring the rank and file, carving a direct path toward Zorfes. The Sorcerer Lord was trying to weave a desperate spell, his hands glowing with a frantic, dying light. He threw a bolt of raw warp energy at the Slayer. Ordinarily, such a strike would have melted a Terminator's plate. The Slayer didn't even dodge. He raised his left arm, the small energy shield on his gauntlet, the Sentinel shield flickering into existence for a microsecond. The warp bolt hit the shield and was redirected into a group of black legionaries, incinerating them instantly. The Slayer's stride didn't even break. He is the ultimate countermeasure, Tyvar realized, his mind spinning with the implications. The Emperor spent 10,000 years trying to build a wall against the warp. This man is the wall. The tide of the battle shifted as the Slayer reached Zorfes. The Sorcerer's chosen, Chaos, Space Marines in Baroque, spiked armor, attempted to intercept him. They were the elite of the Black Legion, warriors who had slain thousands in the name of Abaddon. The Slayer met them with the super shotgun and the blood punch. The first Marine was hit point blank, his chest cavity caving in as the explosive shockwave of the Slayer's gauntlet bypassed his armor entirely. So the second was caught by the meat hook, dragged into a flying knee that shattered his helmet and the skull within. Zorfes, seeing his guard dismantled in seconds, attempted to flee into a shadow rift. The Slayer was faster, so they began a disciplined retreat, the toughness of their training overriding their fear. But the Custodes were already upon them, ensuring that no traitor left the manufacturum alive. When the dust settled, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a graveyard. The Slayer stood in the center of the room, the red glow of the crucible fading as he retracted the blade. He looked at Tyvar, his visor unreadable. "You have ended a great evil this day," Tyvar said, approaching slowly. He noted that the Slayer didn't reload. He didn't need to. He had harvested enough essence from the Fallen to replenish his stores. "But you have also revealed a terrifying truth. You're not just a warrior, stranger. You are a catalyst. Not your presence is forcing this world to choose between the madness of the warp and the absolute cold of your void." The Slayer didn't respond. He turned his gaze toward the ceiling, toward the higher spires of Bastion Primus. He knew the rot didn't end with Zorphas. There was something deeper, something ancient, buried in the hive's foundations, a warp beacon that the Black Legion had been using to lure the Great Rift closer to the world. "There is more, isn't there?" Tyvar asked, reading the Slayer's posture. The Slayer nodded once. He pointed toward a massive, reinforced blast door at the far end of the hall, the path to the hive's geothermal core. "Very well," Tyvar said, his golden armor reflecting the dim light of the dying fires. "We have seen what you are capable of. We have seen that your toughness is a match for the Emperor's finest. If the core must be purged, let it be done by both the gold and the green." Voltar stepped up beside his captain. "And if the void consumes us all in the process?" Tyvar looked at the Slayer. "Then we shall be the last things the darkness ever sees." The Slayer turned and began the long walk toward the blast doors. The Null-Effect followed him like a loyal hound, and behind him, the Custodes fell into a perfect flanking formation. They were no longer jailers, they were a strike team. The descent into the geothermal core of Bastion Primus was a journey through the cooling veins of a dying god. The air grew thick with the taste of sulfur and the rhythmic, bone-shaking hum of macro pumps that had been laboring since the era of the Great Crusade. Here, the Null-Effect of the Slayer was intensified by the enclosed space, creating a vacuum of sound that swallowed the clatter of the Custodes' Auramite boots. But as they reached the primary transition deck, a vast circular platform suspended over a lake of molten slag, the Slayer stopped. He didn't look at the gates ahead. He looked up into the shadows of the vaulted ceiling. A series of high-intensity floodlights flared to life, bathing the platform in a harsh, blue-white glare. From the darkness of the observation gantry, a figure emerged. He was not a giant, but he carried an aura of authority that rivaled a shield captain. He wore a suit of ornate black power armor draped in a cloak of silver-threaded fur. In one hand, he held a staff topped with the letter I, wreathed in blue flame. In the other, a remote activation slate. "Shield Captain Tyvar," the figure said, his voice amplified by a vox caster that carried the weight of an executioner's axe. "I am Inquisitor Vane of the Ordo Malleus. You are in the company of a classified anomaly. Stand aside and let the Emperor's holy justice be done." Tyvar didn't lower his spear. "Inquisitor, this world is under the protection of the Aquilan Shield. This anomaly has done more to stabilize Kaltos in 3 hours than your Ordo has done in a century. He is an ally of necessity." "Ally?" Vane spat, his eyes fixed on the Slayer. "He is a walking blasphemy. He is a hole in the universe that eats the Emperor's light as readily as it eats the warp. He is a tool, Shield Captain, and a tool belongs to the one with the strength to wield it." The Slayer's visor hummed. He didn't understand the politics of the Inquisition, but he knew the smell of a cage. He shifted his weight, his hand hovering near the super shotgun. "Don't," Vane warned, his thumb hovering over the slate. "I have studied the reports from the surface. I know about your toughness. Stranger, I know that physical weapons are useless against you, but you are within a hexagrammic grid of my own design, forged on Titan, etched in the blood of martyrs, and powered by the core of this very hive." Before Tyvar could intervene, Vane pressed the slate. The floor of the platform ignited with a blinding and white-hot geometry. A cage of pure psychic energy, not drawn from the warp, but refined from the collective faith of 1,000 tortured psychers, shrieked into existence around the Slayer. These were the soul chains, a radical technology the Ordo Malleus used to bind greater demons for interrogation. The Slayer roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that had echoed through the halls of hell for eons. He slammed his fists against the white bars of the cage. Usually, his Null-Effect would simply dissolve such constructs, but Vayne had anticipated this. The bars weren't made of warp stuff, they were made of order. They were the absolute, rigid laws of the Imperium given physical form, designed to contain the chaotic void the Slayer represented. "Stop this, Vayne!" Tyvar shouted, and his guardian spear sparking as he stepped toward the Inquisitor. "You are playing with forces you do not comprehend. The Slayer's resonance is too great. The grid cannot hold him." "It will hold," Vayne screamed, his face contorted in a mask of fanatical zeal. "If I can bind him, I can use him to seal the Great Rift. I will be the one who saves the segmentum, not some golden ghost or a green-armored relic." The Slayer was no longer just hitting the bars. He was vibrating. The green light of the divinity machine within him began to leak through the joints of his Praetor suit. The Null-Effect spiked, clashing with the hexagrammic ward in a violent display of reality-warping static. The air around the cage began to tear. The smell of scorched ozone was replaced by a metallic and salty scent, the smell of the universe being pulled apart at the seams. The backlash was instantaneous. The hive's geothermal core, tapped to power the wards, let out a mechanical scream. The pumps reversed. The lake of slag below began to churn into a vortex. "The core is destabilizing," Voltar voxed, struggling to stay upright as the platform buckled. "The Inquisitor's tech is creating a feedback loop. If the Slayer doesn't break free, he'll take the entire hive with him." The Slayer reached for the crucible hilt, but the soul chains constricted, pinning his arms to his sides. Vayne's face turned from triumph to terror as he realized the toughness of the Slayer wasn't just physical. It was ontological. The Slayer was too real for the cage, and the cage was too rigid for the Slayer. Tyvar made a choice. He didn't attack the Inquisitor, so he attacked the cage. "Custodes, target the anchor points, shatter the grid." The 5 golden giants ignored the Inquisitor's stormtroopers, who had opened fire with hot-shot laser guns. The Custodes moved like a single, multi-headed beast. Their guardian spears carved through the ferrocrete floor, severing the cables that fed the hexagrammic ward. Voltar used his spear's bolter to detonate the primary power capacitors on the observation gantry. The cage flickered. The Slayer saw his opening. He didn't use a weapon. He used his voice. A guttural, ancient word in the language of the Night Sentinels tore from his throat, a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 fallen warriors. The sheer sonic pressure, combined with the failing wards, caused the psychic cage to shatter outward in a shockwave of silver glass. The backlash hit Inquisitor Vayne like a freight train. He was thrown back against the wall of the observation gantry, his black armor cracking, his staff snapping in two. The Null-Effect, now unchecked and fueled by the Slayer's rage, expanded in a massive, invisible sphere. Every stormtrooper in the room collapsed, their minds not erased, but reset by the sheer absence of the warp. The hive's machinery ground to a halt. The blue-white floodlights shattered, leaving the room illuminated only by the orange glow of the slag below. The Slayer stood in the center of the ruins, his breathing heavy, his visor glowing with a faint, predatory red light. He looked at Tyvar. He didn't attack. He seemed to understand that the gold had saved the green, even if it was for their own reasons. Then he turned his gaze toward the wounded Inquisitor. So the Slayer walked toward the gantry, his boots making a slow, deliberate clink, clink, clink on the metal stairs. Vayne tried to crawl away, his hand fumbling for a digital weapon in his ring. "Stay back," Vayne croaked, blood leaking from his ears. "I am an agent of the throne. I am the Emperor's will." The Slayer reached down and grabbed the Inquisitor by the collar of his expensive furs. He lifted the man as if he weighed nothing. The Slayer didn't draw a blade. He didn't pull a trigger. He simply looked at Vayne, really looked at him, with a gaze that stripped away the Inquisitor's titles, his honors, and his delusions of grandeur. Vayne saw the truth then. He didn't see a hero. He didn't see a demon. He saw a man who had been fighting the dark for so long that he had become the dark's natural predator. But he saw a toughness that didn't need the Imperium's faith to exist. The Slayer tossed Vayne toward Tyvar. The Inquisitor hit the floor at the shield captain's feet, broken and sobbing. "He is yours," the Slayer's posture seemed to say. Tyvar looked down at the ruined Inquisitor. "The Inquisition will have words with you, Vayne, but for now, you're a distraction. The core is still unstable, and the Black Legion's beacon is active just below us." The Slayer didn't wait for the lecture. He turned and leapt from the platform, disappearing into the dark maw of the geothermal shaft, heading toward the very heart of the hive. "Volta, stay here. Secure the Inquisitor and the survivors," Tyvar commanded, his jump pack whining as he prepared to follow. "The rest of you, with me, we have a world to save. Yours and a god-killer to keep in sight." As Tyvar plummeted into the darkness, he realized that the Imperium's greatest sin wasn't its brutality or its zeal. It was its arrogance. They thought they were the toughest things in the universe. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The descent into the absolute base of Bastion Primus was a plunge into a world where biology had no right to exist. Below the geothermal pumps lay the foundation shunts, ancient cavernous vaults designed to vent the hive's tectonic stresses. Here, the temperature hovered at a constant, blistering 100 degrees Celsius. The air was a thick, toxic soup of lubricating oil and volcanic gases. Shield Captain Tyvar's auramite plate hummed, its internal cooling systems working at 80% capacity to keep his transhuman blood from boiling. Beside him, the Slayer moved with the same relentless, mechanical gait, the heat distortion making his green silhouette ripple like a ghost in the haze. Tyvar watched the Slayer's back. He noticed that the Praetor suit wasn't just resisting the heat, it was venting it in controlled, rhythmic pulses, as if the armor itself were breathing. There was no fatigue in the stranger's stride. There was no hesitation. To a custodian who viewed every movement as a philosophical statement, the Slayer was a terrifyingly pure syllogism. He existed to destroy, and therefore, he destroyed. "We are approaching the primary resonance point," Tyvar said, his voice crackling through the Vox link he had established with the Slayer's helmet. He wasn't sure if the man could speak, or if he simply chose not to, but the Slayer's visor tilted slightly in acknowledgement. "The Black Legion's beacon is not a machine. My sensors indicate it is a warp anchor, a captive shard of a dying star, bound in hexagrammic wards and fed by the souls of 1,000 sacrifices. It is what draws the great rift toward Kaltos." The Null-Effect was now so dense it felt like a physical weight against Tyvar's chest. The silence was no longer an absence of sound. It was an active, predatory thing that swallowed the hum of his guardian spear. They turned a final corner, stepping onto a wide obsidian bridge that spanned a chasm of white-hot magma. At the center of the bridge stood the beacon. It was a monolith of black stone, 30 feet tall, pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly violet light. Around it, the air was a literal storm of warp energy, ghosts of the warp clawing at the boundaries of reality. Guarding the monolith were the Unfleshed, 3 obliterators of the Black Legion. These were monstrosities of meat and metal, their bodies fused with heavy weaponry, and their very DNA rewritten by the techno-virus of the warp. As the Slayer and the Custodes stepped onto the bridge, the obliterators' limbs shifted, flesh and steel knitting together to form multi-barreled autocannons and las cutters. "The gold in the void," one of the obliterators rasped, its voice a grinding of rusted gears. "You are too late. The anchor is set. The rift comes to claim its own." The Slayer didn't wait for a rebuttal. He reached over his shoulder and drew a weapon the Custodes had not yet seen, the BFG 9000. It was a massive, boxy construct of matte black metal, glowing with a pulsating emerald core. Tyvar's internal auspex flared with warnings he had never seen. Hazard, extra-dimensional energy. Hazard, molecular destabilization. The Slayer pulled the trigger. The sound was not a bang, but a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in the very atoms of the bridge. A sphere of brilliant green plasma drifted from the barrel, moving with deceptive slowness. As it traveled, tendrils of emerald energy lashed out, connecting with everything in the room. When these tendrils touched the warp ghosts, the entities didn't just vanish, they burst into nothingness. When they touched the obliterators, the traitor Marine's armor began to peel away in molten strips. Then, the sphere hit the beacon. The resulting explosion was a silent whiteout of pure kinetic force. Tyvar was forced to slam his spear into the bridge to keep from being blown into the magma below. When his vision cleared, the obliterators were gone, reduced to charred smears on the obsidian. The beacon, however, remained. It was cracked, its violet light flickering, but the toughness of its warp-bound architecture was resisting even the BFG's output. The Slayer tossed the empty BFG aside, its magnetic tether snapping it back to his suit, and drew the crucible once more. "Wait," Tyvar commanded, stepping forward. He looked at the crucible's blade, then at the beacon. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of theological vertigo. The energy in the Slayer's blade was the same energy that had just cleared the air of the warp. It was unholy by Imperial standards. It did not come from the God Emperor, but it was anti-warp in its very essence. "Stranger," Tyvar said, his voice solemn. "The energy you wield, it is a mirror to the warp. If you strike that anchor with the crucible, you will not just break the device, you will create a vacuum. The Null-Effect will become a permanent scar on this world. No psyker will ever breathe here again. No soul will ever find its way to the Emperor's light from Kaltos. You are about to condemn this world to a different kind of death. A death of silence." The Slayer paused. He looked at the crucible, the red blade hissing in the toxic air. He looked at Tyvar. For the first time, the toughness of the Slayer seemed to include a capacity for heavy moral weight. He knew what it was to lose a world. He knew what it was to be the only thing left in a silent universe. Behind them, the bridge shook. A fresh wave of black legionaries, led by a pair of greater possessed, was sprinting across the span. They were the last-ditch defense, driven by a desperation that bordered on madness. "We are out of time," Tyvar shouted, leveling his spear. "The vacuum or the warp, stranger. I choose." The Slayer didn't choose the vacuum. He did something that Tyvar, in all his years of tactical study, could not have predicted. He didn't strike the beacon. He struck the bridge. With a roar of effort, the Slayer drove the crucible deep into the obsidian floor. The red energy didn't just cut, it flowed into the structural fault lines of the hive's foundation. The Slayer wasn't trying to erase the beacon, he was trying to drop it. "He is using the planet's own gravity as the weapon," Voltar voxed, having just arrived at the transition deck above. The obsidian bridge shattered. As the central span plummeted toward the magma lake, taking the beacon and the charging black legionaries with it, the Slayer leaped. He didn't leap for safety. He leaped onto the falling monolith. Tyvar watched, frozen as the Slayer rode the beacon down. As in midair, the Slayer began to strike the monolith with his fists, his blood punch sending shockwaves through the stone, widening the cracks the BFG had started. He was making sure that when it hit the magma, it wouldn't just sink, it would shatter. "He's a madman," Voltar whispered over the vox. "No," Tyvar replied, watching the green spark of the Slayer's armor disappear into the white-hot glare of the magma lake. "He's the only one among us who understands that to save a world, you must sometimes be willing to fall with it." The impact was a pillar of fire that reached the ceiling. The warp anchor shattered, its captive star shard dissipating into the geothermal heat, its energy neutralized by the planetary mass before it could create a psychic vacuum. The great rift above Kaltos didn't vanish. but its grip loosened. The purple skies began to fade into a bruised, natural gray. Tyvar stood at the edge of the broken bridge, looking down into the fire. He waited. He didn't know why, but he waited. A custodian did not hope, but Tyvar found himself checking his chronometer, counting the seconds. 10 seconds. 20. Then, a gauntlet, scented with ash and scorched ceramite, clamped onto the edge of the obsidian span. The Slayer hauled himself up. His armor was blackened, his cloak a singed ruin, and his visor was cracked, revealing a single burning eye that looked as if it had seen the end of time and found it wanting. He stood before the Custodes, dripping with molten rock that cooled and fell away in gray flakes. He was the toughest thing Tyvar had ever seen, and for the first time, the shield captain didn't feel the need to demand he surrender, for he simply nodded. "The anchor is gone," Tyvar said. "But the war for the surface is just beginning. The Black Legion still holds the upper hives." The Slayer didn't speak. He reached down, picked up a discarded chain axe from a fallen traitor, tested its weight, and then looked toward the elevators. The message was clear. The harvest was not yet over. The siege of Bastion Primus did not end with the destruction of the anchor. It merely changed its shape. As Tyvar and the Slayer ascended from the planetary depths, they emerged into a war zone that had transitioned from a localized uprising to a full-scale planetary invasion. The sky above the spires was a chaotic tapestry of fire and iron. Black Legion dreadclaws rained down like burning needles, punching into the upper hab blocks to vomit out squads of Chaos Terminators. The surviving Iron Hands, led by the battered Brother Sergeant Arkan, had barricaded the Hive's primary spaceport, making a desperate final stand against a tide of madness that threatened to swallow the city whole. To a standard human, a space marine is a god of war, a walking tank that knows no fear. To the Black Legion, because the toughness of the Imperium's defenders was merely a wall to be ground down. But as the elevator doors hissed open at the spire's summit, the traitor Marines encountered something that bypassed the scale of their 10,000-year war. The Slayer did not wait for the elevator to fully settle. He kicked the doors off their tracks, the heavy plasteel slabs spinning through the air like lethal frisbees, decapitating a pair of cultists who had been setting up a heavy stubber. He stepped out into the biting wind of the upper spire, his boots crunching on the frost-dusted ferrocrete. Behind him, the Custodes emerged, their auramite armor catching the dim, cold light of the Kaltos sun. "The spaceport must hold," Tyvar commanded, his Vox grill broadcasting on all frequencies. "Iron Hands, hold your positions. The Emperor's gold has arrived, us and with us. The end." The Black Legion War Band, a veteran contingent known as the Heralds of Despair, saw the newcomers. Their leader, a Chaos Lord clad in cataphractii Terminator plate, leveled a combi melter. "The 10,000! Here! It matters not. Kill them! Kill the Gold Ghosts and the Green Heretic!" The assault that followed was a masterclass in the hierarchy of violence. The Iron Hands were tough. They stood like statues, their bolters barking in rhythmic synchronization, refusing to yield even as their limbs were sheared off by incoming fire. They were the benchmark of Imperial resilience. But the Custodes were the evolution. Tyvar and Voltaire moved through the incoming fire, not as tanks, but as lightning. They parried bolter shells mid-air with their guardian spears, the explosive rounds detonating harmlessly against the power fields of their blades. They were too fast to hit, too precise to fail. Then there was the Slayer. He was the Null-Effect made manifest. As he sprinted across the open tarmac of the spaceport, the Chaos Terminators found their warp-enhanced senses failing. Their gifts from the Dark Gods, the precognitive whispers, the unnatural strength, the flickering shadow veils, were snuffed out as the Slayer drew near. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a tactical dead zone. The Slayer switched to the chain gun, the barrels spinning into a blur. He didn't use the standard firing mode. He deployed the mobile turret. A literal wall of lead disintegrated a squad of Black Legionaries in seconds, their power armor shredded like wet parchment. When a Chaos Dreadnought, a towering sarcophagus of metal and screaming meat, lumbered toward him, the Slayer didn't take cover. He used the meat hook to reel himself into the machine's chassis. In midair, the Slayer switched to the Sentinel Hammer. He brought it down on the Dreadnought's crown with a shockwave that cracked the spaceport's reinforced floor. The machine's sensory arrays shattered. The Slayer landed, grabbed a dangling hydraulic cable, and used his raw, primeval strength to wrench the Dreadnought's arm from its socket. He then shoved his super shotgun into the exposed pilot's compartment and pulled the trigger. The explosion of gore and oil was the only punctuation the Slayer needed. "By the Omnissiah," Sergeant Arkan whispered from the barricade, his bionic eye whirring as it struggled to track the Slayer's movements. "I've fought alongside the Great Angels. I've seen the Primarch of the 13th in the flesh. But this is not war. This is a culling." Tyvar, spear deep in a Chaos Terminator's chest, glanced toward the Slayer. He saw the gap. Space Marines were the peak of human martial prowess, but they were still human at their core, bound by biology and the laws of the Imperium. The Custodes were the peak of the Emperor's craft, transcendent and perfect. But the Slayer existed outside the scale. He was an elemental force, a being who didn't just endure the 41st millennium, but seemed to be the universe's way of fighting back. The heralds of despair began to break. They had survived the Horus Heresy and the Scouring, but they had never faced a foe that simply ignored their terror tactics. And the Null-Effect was driving their possessed weapons to malfunction. The demons bound to their blades were screaming, trying to flee back to the warp to escape the Slayer's presence. "Fall back to the ships," the Chaos Lord screamed, realizing his warband was being systematically erased. The void is eating our souls." The Slayer didn't let them fall back. He drew the ballista. The weapon hummed as he charged a destroyer blade. He unleashed the horizontal wave of energy, which cleaved through the legs of the retreating traitors, pinning them to the tarmac. As the Custodes moved in to deliver the final mercy, Tyvar stood beside the Slayer. The green giant was reloading, the metallic click of his weapons the only sound in the now quiet spaceport. But the Null-Effect had stabilized the local reality so thoroughly that the warp fire had gone out, leaving only the mundane, freezing wind of Kaltos. Tyvar looked at the iron hands, then at the piles of shattered Black Legion armor. He saw the survivors of the PDF looking at the Slayer not with the religious awe they reserved for the Custodes, but with a primal, fearful respect. "You have shown them a truth they were not ready for," Tyvar said softly. "You have shown them that the toughness they pride themselves on is a fragile thing when faced with a being who does not acknowledge the darkness as a master." The Slayer didn't look at the survivors. He looked at the horizon, where the great rift still shimmered, a jagged wound in the sky. He knew that Kaltos was just one world. He knew that this universe was an endless, churning ocean of the very things he was born to destroy. For the first time, Tyvar saw the Slayer as more than a weapon. He saw a man burdened by an infinite task. The Custodes protected a throne. The Slayer was a one-man crusade against an entire dimension. "The warport is secure," Voltar reported, his golden plate covered in traitor blood. "The Black Legion is in full retreat from the sector, but Shield Captain, the Inquisitorial reinforcements are arriving, and they are not coming to thank us." The Slayer turned his head. His visor hummed as he zoomed in on the flickering lights of approaching Valkyries and Inquisitorial black ships. He didn't need to be told. The Imperium's gratitude was often a cage, and for a being like him, there was no place in their rigid order. The Slayer looked at Tyvar, and then at the crucible hilt on his back. He made a choice. He wouldn't wait for the bureaucrats and the zealots to decide his fate. He had seen the rift. He had seen the source. He pointed a gauntlet toward the sky, toward the Cicatrix Maledictum itself. "You intend to go there?" Tyvar asked, his voice thick with an unexpected surge of respect. "Into the heart of the madness?" The Slayer didn't answer. He simply began to walk toward the largest, most intact Black Legion lander on the tarmac. He didn't need a pilot. He didn't need a navigator. He was the navigator of his own vengeance. The sky above the spaceport did not just darken, it curdled. The Inquisitorial fleet, led by the heavy cruiser Malleus Domini, descended through the cloud layer like a jagged black blade. Hundreds of Valkyries and sleek, predatory interceptors swarmed the airspace, their searchlights cutting through the smog to fix on the lone green figure standing atop the ramp of the hijacked Black Legion lander. This was the arrival of the Imperium's true authority. Not the desperate PDF or the logical iron hands, but the cold, uncompromising will of the Ordo Malleus. "Attention, Adeptus Custodes!" A voice boomed from the overhead vox casters of the descending ships, cold and devoid of emotion. "This is Inquisitor Lord Valerius. You are harboring a Class Omega Xenos temporal anomaly. By the decree of the High Lords of Terra, you are to immediately incapacitate the subject and prepare it for extraction. Any resistance will be viewed as an act of high treason against the Golden Throne." Tyvar stood at the base of the lander's ramp, his guardian spear planted firmly in the ferrocrete. He looked at the descending ships, then back at the Slayer. The Green Giant was ignore the threats. He was busy. Inside the lander's cockpit, the Slayer had plugged the Vega backup drive into a corrupted logic altar. The alien A. I was currently engaged in a brutal digital war with the lander's machine spirit, purging the scrap code of the Black Legion and slaving the ship's engines to a new, singular purpose. "Shield Captain," Voltar whispered, his hand tightening on his spear. "The Inquisition brings a full regiment of scions and a cadre of Null Maidens. They are prepared for a psychic war we have already won. If we defy them, we risk a civil conflict on the steps of a graveyard. The Inquisition sees a specimen to be dissected," Tyvar replied, his golden helm reflecting the harsh searchlights of the hovering Valkyries. "I see the only being in this sector who has faced the Great Rift and didn't blink. Space Marines are built to endure the 41st millennium. This man was built to end it. Which is the greater service to the Emperor?" The first of the Valkyries touched down, its side doors sliding open to reveal squads of tempestuous scions in matte black carapace armor. They moved with a clinical, terrifying precision, their hotshot lasguns leveled at the Custodes. Behind them stepped a figure in heavy red and gold robes, his face a mask of bionic augmentations, Inquisitor Lord Valerius. "Tyvar," Valerius said, his voice a mechanical rasp. "Step aside. That creature is a walking violation of every law in the Lex Imperialis. Its resonance is killing our astropaths across 3 systems. It is a pariah entity of such magnitude that it could extinguish the Astronomicon itself if it reaches Terra." The Slayer stepped out onto the ramp of the lander. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't ignite the crucible. He simply stood there, his presence radiating a Null-Effect so potent that the Scion's HUDs began to flicker and fail. The very air around him seemed to warp, not with the touch of chaos, but with the weight of a reality that was too dense, too tough for the Imperium to contain. "It is not a pariah," Tyvar said, his voice rising to drown out the roar of the engines. "It is a predator. And you are trying to put a leash on a supernova." The Slayer's visor fixed on Valerius. In his own world, the Slayer had dealt with bureaucrats who thought they could control the fires of hell, the UAC, the Maker drones, the priests of Argent d'Honneur. He saw the same arrogance in the Inquisitor's eyes. He saw a man who would trade 1 billion lives for a fragment of power he could never understand. The Slayer raised a gauntlet and pointed toward the Great Rift, which was pulsing with a renewed, angry light. "He is going to the source," Tyvar translated, stepping into the path of the Scions. "He is taking the fight to the cicatrix maledictum. If you fire on him, you are firing on the only hope Kaltos has of seeing a sunrise that isn't purple." "He is a threat to the purity of the human soul," Valerius screamed, but his fanatical composure breaking. "Scions, open fire. Target the anomaly's joints. Bring it down." The spaceport erupted into a three-way standoff of impossible tension. The Scions, trained to obey without question, squeezed their triggers. A wall of high-intensity las fire slammed into the Slayer's Praetor suit. The Slayer didn't even flinch. The toughness of his armor, reinforced by the essence of 1,000 slain demons, absorbed the heat with a contemptuous hiss. He took one step forward, the shockwave of his footfall cracking the tarmac. He didn't kill the Scions. He didn't need to. He simply unleashed a blood punch into the air in front of him. The resulting kinetic blast wasn't lethal, but it was overwhelming. The Scions were thrown back as if by a physical hand, their formations shattered, their armor dented by the sheer pressure of the air. "Enough!" Tyvar roared. He spun his guardian spear, the power blade humming with a lethal frequency. "By the authority of the Aquilan Shield, this lander is under my protection. Any further act of aggression against this entity will be met with the full wrath of the 10,000. The Custodes moved into a defensive ring around the lander's ramp. 5 golden gods against 1,000 Imperial soldiers. The comparison was stark. The Scions were the best of the best, men who would make a space marine nod in respect. But as they looked at the Custodes, and then at the silent green giant behind them, they felt a fear that no conditioning could erase. They weren't facing a monster. They were facing the Emperor's own judgment, and it was telling them to stand down. Valerius looked at Tyvar, through his bionic eyes whirring. He knew he couldn't win this fight, not without calling in the orbital bombardment of the Malleus Domini, and even then, the Custodes might survive long enough to board his ship. Inside the lander, the engines let out a high-pitched harmonic scream. The Black Legion's corrupt technology had been completely overwritten. The ship wasn't just a transport anymore. It was a vessel of the Night Sentinels, its thrusters glowing with a clean, white-green light. The Slayer looked at Tyvar one last time. There was no salute. There was no word of thanks. There was only a mutual recognition between two beings who had spent their entire existences on a wall, watching the dark. "Go," Tyvar whispered. "Do what we cannot. Break the heart of the storm." The Slayer turned and entered the lander. The ramp hissed shut. As the ship cleared the spaceport, rising on a pillar of emerald fire, it didn't head for the relative safety of the system's edge. It angled upward, directly toward the jagged, screaming maw of the Great Rift. Valerius watched it go, his face pale. "You have doomed us all, Shield Captain. You have let a god-killer into the House of the Soul." "No," Tyvar said, lowering his spear as the wind from the lander's departure whipped his cloak. "I have let the only thing tough enough to survive the 41st millennium go to work. We protect the throne, Inquisitor. He protects the future." The lander hit the upper atmosphere, its hull beginning to glow with the friction of its impossible speed. To the people of Kaltos, it looked like a green star rising to challenge the purple darkness. For a brief moment, the Null-Effect was so strong that the entire planet felt a collective sense of peace, a silence that was both terrifying and beautiful. The Slayer was gone. But the legend of the green flame had just begun. The transition into the cicatrix maledictum was not a voyage. It was a collision between two incompatible versions of reality. As the hijacked lander crossed the threshold of the Great Rift, the physical laws of the universe, gravity, time, and causality, shredded like a sail in a hurricane. For any other vessel, this would have been the moment of dissolution, where the crew's souls were harvested by the laughing hungers of the warp. But the lander was no longer a mundane craft. Fueled by the Slayer's presence and guided by the cold, alien logic of Vega, it had become a null spear, a needle of absolute silence stitching its way through a tapestry of screaming madness. Inside the cockpit, the Slayer stood motionless. He did not need a navigator to see the path. To his eyes, the warp was not a mystery. It was an infestation. Through the cracked visor of his helm, he watched the unreality of the Imperium try to find purchase on his armor. Tentacles of iridescent shadow lashed against the hull, and the faces of 1 billion tormented souls pressed against the viewports, their silent screams begging for release or damnation. Then, the warp fought back. The Dark Gods, sensing a predator within their own domain, did not send a mere army. They sent a conceptual storm. The toughness of the Slayer was being tested at the level of his very soul. The air inside the lander filled with the cloying scent of Nurgle's rot, the intoxicating whispers of Slanesh, the labyrinthine riddles of Tzeentch, and the blinding rage of Khorne. It was a psychic assault that would have turned a Primarch into a puppet. The Slayer simply reached for the sentinel hammer. So he slammed the head of the weapon against the deck plates, and the resulting shockwave of argent energy didn't just clear the air. It created a permanent void cell within the rift. The whispers were silenced. The rot was sterilized. The Slayer wasn't just surviving the warp, he was conquering it, 1 cubic meter at a time. On the surface of Kaltos, Shield Captain Tyvar stood at the edge of the spaceport, looking up. The great rift, which had dominated the sky for months as a jagged purple wound, was changing. A pinprick of emerald light had appeared in its center, a speck of defiance that refused to be swallowed. To the survivors of the Iron Hands and the millions of citizens in the hive below, it looked like a new star being born. "He is doing it," Voltar whispered. His voice hushed with a reverence that a custodian rarely felt for an outsider. "He is carving a path." "He is doing more than that," Tyvar replied, his golden armor reflecting the green shimmer from above. "He is proving that the warp is not inevitable. For 10,000 years we have been told that chaos is a reflection of the human soul, that it is a mirror we cannot break. But he has no mirror. He is the stone that shatters the glass." The lander finally reached the resonance core of the localized rift sector, a swirling vortex of raw chaos where the boundaries between the 4 gods were thinnest. Here, the Slayer stepped out of the lander's airlock, his boots finding purchase on nothingness. He was surrounded by a literal sea of demons, a chaotic soup of greater demons, demon princes, and hordes of the unborn. The Slayer drew the crucible. The blade ignited with a roar that echoed through the psychic dimension, a sound of pure, unadulterated vengeance. He didn't offer a challenge. He began the harvest. In the 41st millennium, the term toughness had always been defined by the ability to endure suffering. The Space Marines endured the loss of their humanity. The Custodes endured the burden of a failing empire. The citizens of the Imperium endured the grinding misery of their existence. But as the Slayer moved through the warp, he redefined the word. Toughness was no longer a shield, it was a sword. It was the ability to look at an infinite darkness and decide, through sheer force of will, that it was the darkness that should be afraid. The battle within the rift lasted a subjective eternity, though on Kaltos, only a few hours passed. And when the emerald light finally faded, the great rift above the Agrippina sector didn't close, but it receded. The Null-Effect, left behind by the Slayer's passage, had created a stable corridor, a dead zone where the warp could no longer manifest. It was a tactical miracle, a strategic asset that the Imperium would spend the next century trying to exploit and understand. The Slayer himself did not return. High Inquisitor Valerius attempted to declare the event a Xenos-sanctioned heresy, but the report was suppressed by the Adeptus Custodes. Tyvar's official record was simple. The anomaly has transitioned beyond the veil. The threat to Kaltos is neutralized. The Emperor's gold remains the only witness. Deep in the archives of the Vigil of Gold, a new scroll was added to the forbidden histories of the 10,000. It spoke of a warrior in green plate who had taught the Emperor's companions a lesson they had forgotten. That even in a galaxy of gods and monsters, a single man with a sharp enough blade and a loud enough gun could change the course of destiny. On a distant, nameless world within the rift, the Slayer sat amidst the smoking remains of a demon citadel. His armor was scarred, his weapons were low on ammunition, and his visor was caked in the dust of evaporated gods. He looked out over the infinite horizon of the warp, where more shadows were already gathering, fearful but hungry. He didn't look tired. He didn't look satisfied. He simply stood up, chambered a fresh shell into his shotgun, and began to walk toward the next fire. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And for the Doomslayer, that was exactly where he was meant to be. The collision between the Doomslayer and the 41st millennium was never going to be a story of diplomacy or integration. The Slayer is a being of singular purpose, a primal force that exists to act as the ultimate corrective to the cancer of chaos. By introducing him to the Adeptus Custodes, we see the two highest forms of toughness in the multiverse acknowledging one another. The Custodes represent the pinnacle of ordered, protective strength, the shield that must never break. The Slayer represents the pinnacle of destructive, proactive strength, the sword that never stops swinging. The resolution of this what if leaves the Warhammer 40,000 universe fundamentally changed, yet hauntingly the same. The Imperium has been given a glimpse of a different kind of victory, one that doesn't rely on the stagnant faith of the ecclesiarchy or the brutal calculations of the Inquisition, but on the absolute, unyielding competence of a warrior who refuses to lose. The Slayer's journey into the Great Rift ensures that while the war for the soul of humanity continues, the shadows are now aware that there is something in the dark that hunts them. The legend of the Green Flame becomes a whisper in the barracks of the Astra Militarum and a riddle in the halls of the Librarius. For the Custodes who fought beside him, the experience is a reminder that their long vigil is not the only way to serve the Emperor's dream. Strength is not just about what you can endure. It is about what you are willing to destroy to ensure that others do not have to endure at all. The Slayer remains in the rift, a walking exterminatus, a silent sentinel of vengeance. He belongs to neither his old world nor this new one, but as long as there are demons to kill and a galaxy to purge, he will be the toughest thing in the dark. The Emperor protects. More stories await. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.